once again for this coming Sunday, which is the 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time, or 19th Sunday of the year. And the scripture readings that are presented for our attention are: the first reading is from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, from the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, and the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. I'd like to begin today by just taking a moment to go back and look at that second reading. You will remember that a few weeks ago we pointed out that the second reading throughout this whole time and for many weeks to come is from the letter of Paul to the Romans. It, of course, was his, we believe, last letter that he wrote. It is his longest letter, and it was written to the community at Rome because he wanted to kind of explain to them what he had been teaching and why. Now, the letter itself is divided, at least we divide it up, into three different sections. Namely, the first section, which is chapters 1 through 8, where Paul talks about the fact that God's graciousness and goodness is for all people. That includes also the Gentiles who were non-Jewish. The second section, which begins today, is chapters 9 through 11, which some call the Cinderella chapters, because for a long time these three chapters were not given a lot of consideration and did cause problems with regard to the Jewish Christian religions. And then the remainder of the work is the last third, goes to the end of the letter itself. Now, what is important about these three chapters, which begin as I mentioned, with verse 1 of chapter 9. It has to do with Paul's relationship to his fellow Hebrews. Now, for a long time, and this little section was either overlooked or not really paid much attention to by Christian writers, it was thought that Paul had argued that no longer were the Jews to be saved, that they were no longer part of the Christian experience. Looking carefully at this, we see that it's not what Paul was saying. In fact, as this little section begins, perhaps it is one of the more confounding passages in Paul's writings, because he is very, and it's unusual for Paul in a certain way, to be emotional. He argues here how painful it is that fellow Hebrews could not and would not accept Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus as the Savior. Now, that's different than rejecting the Jews. Paul here, and throughout his life, one notices that he never gives up being a member of the Hebrew community. He never sets up a dichotomy between Christians and Jews. That simply is not what Paul is saying here. For Paul had spent his whole life, we know, since his conversion experience, which is described in different ways. The Acts of the Apostles describes it as what we know as the Damascus Road journey. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, simply says that he had an encounter with the risen Lord. So something happened that changed his viewpoint from previously the ways that he had been acting. Then Paul had traveled around the Roman Empire, teaching and preaching the good news of Christ, primarily to Gentiles, but also to his own family. His own family here are fellow Hebrews. And it is important to see, although this is an aside, that when the gospel writer Luke, writing his Acts, pictures Paul as the traveler with the gospel message, always sees Paul first announcing the message to fellow Hebrews, and then only to the Gentiles or the non-Hebrews. So You remember that last week, in fact, the little section from Paul's writing had those beautiful and powerful words, "Who will separate us from the love of Christ?" And the point that Paul now makes is nothing will separate us from that love. So Paul here, and this will develop, we will be listening to sections from 9 through 11 over the next couple weeks, at least that second reading, is hurting because he feels that his fellow Hebrews, for whatever reasons, have not accepted the grace of God to accept Jesus as the Messiah. He has great sorrow for his own people, for those whom he has grown up with, and even though he has accepted Jesus and his message and presented it, as we heard, to outsiders, that is, to non-Jews, nevertheless hopes that his fellow Hebrews will accept Jesus. What's important, and what has been rediscovered in kind of looking at this section, was always there, but for whatever reasons, interpreters of Paul's letter never paid a lot of attention to this, is not that there is a division between Jews and Christians, but that there is a sorrow on the fact that many Jews were not able in Paul's time to accept the Jesus message. And as we will hear in the end of this little section, Paul holds out a great hope that eventually, in some time, maybe in his own lifetime, fellow Hebrews will accept Jesus. So I mentioned this little section as we begin because it, unfortunately, at times has been a dividing section as far as Jews and Christians through the centuries have been. But that was not the teaching of Paul. That is not the understanding of Paul here. We will perhaps come back to this a little bit at another time as we listen to the rest of this section, but it begins with a very emotional experience on the part of Paul. He's so saddened that really his fellow Hebrews have not been able to accept Jesus. Now the gospel continues the episodes that we saw last time. You remember that Jesus had tried to go away by himself, that he had been followed by the crowd, that he had pity on the crowd, he healed some, and then he had fed them with this marvelous feeding, the great number, you remember, 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Now, Jesus sends his disciples on a journey across the sea while he himself stays behind to pray. Now, you remember that had begun that section where Jesus had gone off by himself, but they couldn't get away with that. Now, he goes aside to pray. Only twice in Matthew's gospel is Jesus pictured as praying. Praying here, we don't know what the words of his prayer were, only that he prayed, and the other part would be in the Garden of Gethsemane when that episode in his life had happened. So although prayer is important in Jesus' life, Matthew does not see Jesus as praying himself. He does teach others how to pray. He does, of course, the famous Our Father that we have from Matthew, and in other cases preaches the importance of prayer, but it is here that Jesus himself prays. Now, the episode that is mentioned in the gospel today is that the disciples are out on the Sea of Galilee when a storm arises and they are fighting against it. Now, the Sea of Galilee, and I thought this might be just a little bit of an opportunity to mention it, the Sea of Galilee is the major freshwater body in Israel. There are really only two water bodies mentioned. The other one is the Dead Sea, which is down at the shores of the Jordan. Jordan empties into the Dead Sea. But the Sea of Galilee was important, and even today is important, because it is a freshwater source for much of Israel. It is not a large, they call it a sea. It goes by other names. It's sometimes called in Hebrew the Lake of Gennesareth. And in John's Gospel, it is mentioned as the Sea of Tiberias, because the city of Tiberias, built by Herod Antipas, was on one of the shores of this body of water, but more traditionally known as the Sea of Galilee. It is 13 miles from north to south, and it is 7 miles at its widest point east to west. So whether you want to call this a sea, we would probably most likely call it a lake. And maybe that's why the Lake of Gennesareth is a little more accurate than sea. But anyway, if that's the only body of water you have, then that's a big body of water. The shape in Gennesareth, the Hebrew, means harp. And you will notice that looking at the structure of the sea, it does look a little bit like an Irish harp. And so hence the reason for why it is so named. It is, the sea is located 210 feet below sea level, so therefore it is warm because of that. And so the experts who tell us this say that there are 22 species of fish that inhabit the waters of the Sea of Galilee. So there's a little bit of a background. And it is known for, and this is where the Gospels are correct in this point, for sudden storms arising. They just kind of unexpectedly come. There's no prediction as we do today, predicting at what time it's going to rain or it's not going to rain or when the sun's going to shine. They didn't have any of that. So a lot of it was guesswork or experience that certainly fishermen had, but even then they could be caught off guard by a storm. Now, an interesting thing happened in 1986. The level of the Sea of Galilee was declining, or rather, I suppose would be a better word, because the use of water for the Galilee in modern times has so increased that the amount of water in the sea has declined. In fact, interestingly, only this year, 2020, did they get an extraordinary amount of water, and the amount of water in the sea has risen a little bit, but it's shrinking, and that, of course, is a great concern. Well, anyway, in 1986, the level of the sea became extraordinarily low, and maritime archaeologists discovered an ancient fishing boat in the mud along the northwest shore, a little north of where the city of Magdala is or was. And the estimates are, when they looked at the remains of this boat, that they had to very carefully, and it was extremely severe, slow process of taking this boat out of the mud. It was estimated that this boat was made somewhere between the year 40 and 70 of common time. Now, of course, now what do we call it? Well, it's the only boat ever discovered then, so therefore it must be Peter's boat. And so good Christians, of course, call it Peter's boat. The Israelites do not always go along with that name. The length of the boat, 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 4.5 feet deep. Now, originally it had a sail. That was not discovered. And the estimates are that it had 4 oarsmen and a tillerman, and could hold 10 passengers. So you think about it, there would be 5 people working the boat, 10 passengers, 15. Or if you did not have people, then you could use it for cargo. So all of this is very interesting. The boat has been reconstructed. They took a long time to do this. They had to put it as best they could together. They put it in a gas kind of container for about 4 years to make sure that it was preserved as best it could. And now it is on display in in one of the hotels in Israel today. Now, I mention all of this because it's interesting. It tells us a little bit what this boat was like that Peter and his disciples were probably in. As the story that we hear this weekend happens, this sudden storm emerges, and at the fourth watch of the night, now, fourth watch of the night would have been between 3 and 6 in the morning. The Roman custom of dividing the time frame of 24 was into two major quarters. You had the daylight ones, which began at 6 and went to 6 at night, and then the nighttime one, which began at 6 and also went back to 6 in the morning. So if this is the fourth watch of the night, if everything is divided by thirds, you can see why this is the time frame in which Jesus is now pictured in this episode as walking on the water. Now, this is the second time that the disciples have had, or that Matthew rather has described an event with the disciples on the sea. The first one appears in chapter 8, which we have not looked at, and both of these stories are taken over by Matthew from Mark's gospel. He makes a few adjustments, but pretty much tells the same story as does Mark. In the first episode, you will remember, this is not the one that will be read this weekend, is that there's a storm arises. Jesus is with his disciples in the boat. He is in the boat asleep, and this terrible storm arises. Now, right away, who could sleep through a storm? Well, I know some of you might be able to, but Jesus is pictured as sleeping. They're getting all terrible. Finally, they cry out, "Listen, do something." Jesus wakes up and calms the waters, calms the sea. Waters, again, perhaps just as a little aside, were very important, certainly for survival. But waters, even from the very beginning, threatened sometimes human beings. Those of you who are familiar with the story of creation in the first chapter of the book of Genesis will remember that the Spirit of God hovered over the chaotic waters and separated, putting some of the waters up, some of the waters down, creating dry land, so that in the ancient world, the earth was surrounded not by air, as we consider it to be with our space and all that, but was considered to be surrounded by waters. And they will speak of the waters above the heavens, the waters above below the heavens. So waters could be also threatening. That, of course, is why sailors never wanted to sail out of sight of land, although some were able to, particularly in the Mediterranean, because the waters were considered to be the place of great danger and all kinds of sea monsters lived out there, and of course you didn't want to get caught out there. So water. But there's a beautiful understanding of water that is found in a number of places in the Old Testament. One of them is in Psalm 107. Verses 23 to 32. And I thought I'd read those so that we get a sense of how water was perceived in the ancient world, and certainly in Jesus' time. So here's what it says. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to the sons of men. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people, and praise him in the assembly of the elders. So those are words from Psalm 107. But you can see a wonderful way in which water and the power of the wind and the power of the sea was seen as both God-given, God-directed, God-saving. There is a similar kind of psalm found in chapter 2 of the story of Jonah, which we won't look at, but you could check that out too. And also in the story of Jonah, that as he was trying to escape from a command of God, got caught in a terrible storm at sea. Well, so that is the first one that I mentioned. Jesus gets up, quiets the sea, and they gently come to shore. The one that we hear now is that Jesus comes to the disciples amid this storm, walking on the water. Well, now, this would get anyone's attention, and they think at first that it's a ghost, so Jesus has to kind of assure them that it's really him, and then they kind of wonder, well, what's happening here? And it's at that point, and this is something which is unique now to the Matthean tradition, not found in the Mark 1, is Peter. Peter now says to Jesus, if you can walk on water, why can't I? And Jesus says, okay, walk on water. And so Peter is pictured as stepping off of the boat, and everything is all right as long as he keeps looking this way, looking at Jesus. He chooses to look down, and when he realizes what's happening, begins to sink. And he cries out, and Jesus says, well, why did you doubt? Why did you have such little faith? And thus it would seem that Jesus raises up the Peter, and everything is safe. Now you may wonder what that little noise is going on. It's the little children, urchins, running around, thanking God, not for water, but for the gift of the day. So just as an added thought today. So Peter, of course, in this gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, gets special attention. And in fact, in this gospel, Peter is spoken of very well by the gospel writer. You will remember that when it comes to talking about who am I, that Peter says, well, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, well, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And goes on, you have the keys to the kingdom. So Peter here takes this step into the water. Now, who are those? There are all kinds of interpretations of this particular story as to what its meaning. Many interpreters see the disciples in the boat as representing the church. And that could be because, I think I may have mentioned this in an earlier talk, but in this gospel, the word church is used by Matthew. It's the only gospel in which the word church is used. The word church, of course, means those who are assembled. And remember earlier on when we talked about synagogue, had that same idea. The church, therefore, is not a building, but it is the believers. And perhaps one of Matthew's thought here, seeing the sequence of stories about Jesus that have led up to this, is that as Jesus experienced rejection, remember earlier on we mentioned that had happened, and even though God generously fed all those people. Acceptance of the gospel way would not always be pleasantly experienced by them. And that perhaps the church, if the boat is, and sometimes we have seen that image used, you probably have seen pictures of it developed throughout our artistic times, is the place where the community is gathered. And so that the church, the community, the assembled, are those whom God shows his love and kindness for. In this case, Jesus. So, the sea, a gift, water, strengthening, necessary, but also can be threatening, cleansing, and at the same time healing. Jesus asks Peter, "Why do you doubt?" And of course issues those words that are so important, and maybe that's why the early church saw it as this: take heart, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. We are reassured of Jesus' presence so often whenever we gather, certainly to celebrate the Lord's goodness. Quickly, to conclude, is the first reading, which comes from the book of the prophet Elijah. Elijah, you remember, had challenged the king and his queen Jezebel as to the practices that they had allowed to happen. And there had been this great contest, and they were to offer sacrifice to God. The priests of Baal were to do it first. It didn't work. Then comes Elijah's turn. He builds an altar, puts a sacrifice on it, then douses it with water. So maybe here's where some connection might be a little bit to remember. Not only does he douse it once, but twice, but 3 times, so that the altar is pretty wet. And then, of course, calls down fire from heaven and absorbs the whole thing. Well, that was okay, except that then Elijah had ordered the death of all of the priests of Jezebel, some 450, and she wasn't too happy about that. And so he runs for his life. And the episode that we hear now finds Elijah finally coming, with God's help, to the mountain called Horeb, or Sinai, and he's there waiting for God to say something to him. And so different things. He's standing in a cave, kind of watching, waiting for God, and along comes a strong wind. God's not there. Along comes an earthquake. God's not there. Along comes fire. God's not there. And then, and it's interesting what the Hebrew says here, a gentle whisper, a sound of sheer silence, a still, small voice. And it is there that God speaks, and it is there that Elijah knows the presence of God in his life and his support, just as the gospel story saw the presence of Jesus and his support to those in need. Now, those of you who grew up in another generation might notice that a certain team used this sound of silence to make a song out of it. Well, I don't know that silence can be a song, maybe in our heart. Point, of course, of Elijah's little episode is that power of God comes in unexpected ways. Sometimes we think of power, the wind, the earthquake, the storms, but in the silence and quiet comes the marvelous presence of God in our lives too, just as it did for Elijah and for Jesus and for the disciples. Thank you very much for being with us, and have a good week.